I have to say, this is a particular pleasure for me. When my wife and I first moved to Falmouth, and I went down to Falmouth Library, one of the books that I found there, browsing around, I can't remember the actual title, but it was about the myths and the realities of wrecking in Cornwall, and and underpicking, getting underneath the stories to what was a much more complicated picture. And the author was Cathryn Pearce. So it's taken me about 8 years to track Cathryn down, to try and come and give a Café Sci talk. And of course, when it was a matter of coming here in person, that would be more difficult to do. So this is a lovely example for me of a science subject with a history, with a sense of place, what the Cornish identity and Cornish community means to people, but with a distinct scientific, what's the word, discipline to it. A lot of the ideas discussed in the book come from a background in criminology, and I myself have studied sociology of deviance. So some of those I recognize straight away as, oh, this is actually getting to some key issues here in the study. So I am really looking forward to this. So no pressure, Cathryn.
None at all. Well, I did make it for more of a regular audience. Yeah, I will talk about a little bit about sociological theory, but not too much, at least not at the moment. But we can get into that.
The trick is always to mention it, and then if people want to ask questions,
yeah,
dig into that, they can.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of this kind of rather democratizing mode, that the audience in the end takes the question as whatever. So at this point, enough of me. And Cathryn, you want to introduce yourself, or do you do that as part of your presentation?
I don't do that as part of my presentation, so I can probably go ahead and do that, because I'm hoping to remember to turn off my camera too, so people can focus on my slides. But I usually start this. Wave at me. I usually start my presentations because people notice that my accent is different. And it's different because I was raised in Alaska, and I started to do some of this research in Alaska, and then I went to the University of Greenwich to do my PhD. I had actually been back and forth in Cornwall for quite a while. Back then, I didn't know much about my ancestry. I had suspicions, but I didn't know. Yeah, I mean, it's been a kind of a long road in a way. And one of the reasons you probably had a little bit of problems finding me is because I was in Alaska for a long time, and then I came over here, and I was then teaching up at Suffolk, and then I was at Greenwich, and then now I'm at Portsmouth full time. So I've been bouncing around a little bit and teaching in various countries. So yeah, so yes, I'm Cathryn Pearce with the correct spelling of Pearce, actually. most of the time growing up, it was always people spelled my name wrong, so I kind of learned to say it's the Cornish way. So anyway. Right. Okay, well, first off, I do want to thank Robin and the Cornwall science community and Café Scientifique for inviting me. I'm a historian. I'm not necessarily a scientist, although, when I think about it, I did actually almost major in biology. So I do have a bit of a scientific background. But I am an historian. I am now a descendant of the Cornish diaspora, I now know. But thank you for inviting me to talk about a subject that has fascinated me since my first visit to Cornwall, and that was back in 1982. But the topic of wrecking actually became a center of my academic world as I was working on my doctorate. And of course, since then, it has literally changed my life and given me opportunities that I never would have dreamed that I would have. Okay, so we all know that Cornwall is known for wrecking. And we've got popular beliefs, these myths of wrecking are widespread. And these are just a few from both outside of Cornwall and inside Cornwall that I've encountered over the years of doing my research. And some of you might recognize some of these. But in today's presentation, I'd like to investigate some of these in a little bit more detail, not necessarily to debunk them, but to understand them better. I have to agree with a fellow historian who wrote that a historian's critical faculties need to be used for purposes other than sifting truth from falsehood. Deciphering the meaning of stories is a subtler fare altogether. And I think it's actually, no, to me, it's more fun to really get into the meaning behind some of these stories. So that's what I plan to do now, to look at these in a little bit more depth, to tease out some of the nuances of commonly held beliefs for about 20 minutes and then open it up for questions. But what I am presenting here is all grounded in an immense amount of historical evidence, and I should say a large amount. It didn't actually make it into my book because there was so much to back up all my various points, but I won't give it all to you tonight. The title for this presentation is taken from a best-selling poem called The Shipwreck that was written by William Falconer in 1762. And although his poem was written about his experience being wrecked in the Mediterranean, he actually used his voice, his poem, to attack wreckers that were closer to home in England. And especially he wanted to attack the justices of the peace who are expected to control them. So that's where he wrote, "Where the grim hell-hounds prowling round the shore, with foul intent the stranded bark explore. Deaf to the voice of woe, her decks they board, while tardy justice slumbers o'er her sword." So pretty grim. But if we're going to be looking at the stereotype of the wreckers, of course, going back to writers like Falconer is a good start. But he is actually preceded in using such rhetoric by Daniel Defoe, and Daniel Defoe isn't even the first. You might be familiar with Defoe describing Solonians in 1724 as a fierce and ravenous people. They are so greedy and eager for their prey. Interestingly enough, Defoe never went to the Isles of Scilly. But even newspapers use similar language. The Western Flying Post in 1750 described wreckers as swarms of plunderers and a mob of obstinate and lawless villains. But one of the favorite one of mine that I came across with the Sherborne Mercury in 1751 is those greedy cormorants waiting for their prey, more barbarous in their nature than cannibals. Amongst these greedy wolves, there were so many of their kind that made so free with the spirit and were so exasperated with each other that they stripped even to their buff and fought like devils. Well, by the mid-19th century, this language was tempered a bit, not by much. Wreckers were still mobs. They were still ferocious multitudes. They were. We have action! It is used to set up an us versus them dialogue, although there are many layers to it, and it comes from opposing directions, both from outside and inside Cornwall, and also from the elites and the press towards commoners. And I have a feeling that commoners probably said the similar things towards elites sometimes. But interestingly enough, Falconer's poem was not describing Cornish wreckers, but those of the Northumberland coast, because wrecking was actually an activity found on all coasts. But before looking at who the wreckers were, I would like to quickly go over what wrecking means, because it can be defined in different ways, and these definitions are really important to looking at who the wreckers actually were. So this is probably familiar to almost everybody, that for a lot of people, particularly outside of Cornwall especially, wrecking is popularly understood to mean deliberately wrecking ships using false lights. And there is some confusion about this particular trope. I think people have argued that it really doesn't make sense. I think even BBC has it in various programs trying to test it out. But there's this idea that false lights would act as a lighthouse, and that doesn't really make sense because lighthouses denote danger, to stay away. But this mistake is most likely the result of what historians have been calling sea blindness. That's a cultural loss of knowledge and connection with shipping by sail, because the false lights of legend was about the placing of lanterns on cliffs or around the necks of horses or donkeys to to actually make it look like there's a vessel stern light there, and that's to lure in vessels which expected to have more sea room. There's actually no historical evidence to uphold the charge that wreckers used false lights. That's not to say that there was not deliberate wrecking. There was, but that was done through rather less romantic ways of deliberate wrecking, such as cutting of the ship's cables to let the wind push it ashore, or there was the drilling of holes in the hull for insurance purposes. So those were some of the ways there was deliberate wrecking. So no lights around a donkey's or horse's neck. That'd be really, I feel sorry for the horse or donkey there. But wrecking is also defined by some as the act of viciously tearing ships to pieces after they run aground, and possibly killing survivors as they came ashore. And these beliefs are based on a mix of legend and reality. Yes, there are a few cases where wrecked ships were, like George Borlase has said about local tinners, that they'll cut a large trading vessel to pieces in one tide and cut down everybody that offers to oppose him. Some of that is hyperbole, by the way. But there is, though, again, no evidence of murder in recent times. I did come across some murders, but that was in 12th century Sussex, not Cornwall necessarily. But the charge of murder comes from a popular understanding of what a wreck is and who had legal access to it. The phrase, where a man, a dog, or a cat escape out of a ship, that such ship nor barge nor anything within them shall be adjudged a wreck, is from the Statute of Westminster in 1275. And this had entered popular understanding really early on. And so we've got the development stories and legends that claim that any survivors or any dogs or cats even would need to be killed for it to be a legal wreck, and so fair game. But again, there's no evidence that this actually happened when the wrecking stories are examined. When it comes down to it, I don't think that this particular story would probably stop somebody if they really were intent on it. But if it did, this wasn't recorded at all. No attacks such as that, and what stories there are don't really hold up to scrutiny. There's also a definition of wrecking that is of harvesting shipwrecks, the carrying away of remains of ships and cargoes that have washed ashore. And this is a relatively benign activity, but it is a crime in that commoners have never had the legal right to take wreck away. It belonged to the manorial lords, or it belonged to the owners of the cargoes of the ships. But there is a really interesting popular custom that I found not just in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, but in other coastal regions as well, such as Kent and Sussex, even, and up in Scotland as well. But the custom is actually, if something comes ashore, that people would actually split the findings 50-50 with the lord of the manor. And that's the most common form of wrecking. And sometimes whole ships and masts would come ashore and be found. But this is wrecking as harvest, which is a concept that Robert Hawker Morwenstow talks about, as well as some other writers of the time. And it kind of fits, like people are harvesting what is coming ashore. But there are other forms of wrecking. The term is used for diving on wrecks or even legally salvaging wrecks. But that's a particular meaning that's used in the Bahamas. But of course, I'm focused in the meanings that are used in Cornwall. And that actually, looking at all these different definitions, there is that question of how often did wrecking actually occur? And from the records and the stories, you'd think that it would actually happen all the time. But there are actually very few cases recorded of wholesale attack and plunder of vessels. This is a chart that I compiled based on cases that were described in the Penzance Customs Collector letter books for Mounts Bay. And Mounts Bay, of course, is an area that had a large number of wrecks. It had a more complete set of records, but it also was well known for being an area of wreckers. But if we had more complete records of other districts, I think it would be interesting to see if there's any similarity, and I expect there probably is. possibly even less attacks. But you can see that in a period from 1738 to 1860, there was 155 shipwrecks recorded there. Only 11 were recorded as being attacked and plundered. 5 of them were recorded as harvest, but it's because harvest was so commonplace. And then they did discuss about 18 that they said they protected, but whether or not they were actually in danger from being attacked, it's kind of hard to say. But it is impossible to determine how many wrecking events there were. Most wrecks occurred offshore. They were difficult to get to. More frequently, the accounts record only pieces of wrecked timber or barrels of goods washing ashore. So the more violent behavior, the mistreatment of shipwreck victims, that may have been exceptional. There just are few recorded cases of direct inhumanity. And what I did find was that there were many more accounts of life-saving than there were even stories or even legends of life-taking. So that has actually led me to my current research on life-saving in coastal communities that I'm working on right now. So who were those grim hellhounds, those greedy cormorants, and for some of us, our ancestors? What these forms have in common is that the press, government authorities, and even novelists often did not differentiate between the practices. All were considered equally heinous and barbaric, from relatively benign harvest, if it's nuts spread on the beach or whatever, to the attack and plunder of vessels. They were all considered atrocities of the other. And this dominant view of wreckers has been defined and popularized both within and outside of Cornwall. In contemporary writings, if they weren't barbarians or ruffians, they were the country people. And this is an urban metropolitan view where Cornish rural folk are stereotyped as simple, as rough, as uncivilized even. But this language was also used within Cornwall by the gentry, by religious elites, and also by newspapers. These groups othered rural communities in many ways, not just in their discussion of wrecking, of course, but it's a bit deceiving here because this is an example of having to read between the lines to see who is pointing fingers and claiming people are wrecking and actually what the speakers were actually up to themselves, as we'll see. But on my visits to Cornwall, I usually found mixed attitudes towards wrecking. Either it was we all did it with some great stories attached, and I know some people were trying to pull my leg, or it was the miners or the tinners did it, or we didn't do that. But earlier academic research on wrecking by Cornish historian John Rule had treated the Cornish coastal population as a monolithic society as well, where everyone accepted and was involved in wrecking. But what I found was that it wasn't so clear-cut, that in fact Cornish folk didn't all engage in wrecking. And for those who did, their motives were very complex and have been lost in the storytelling. Yes, there is evidence that the tinners were involved in the attack and plunder of ships on numerous occasions. Bragg and Gurmo in particular had a bad reputation for wrecking, as evidenced by this famous couplet of "God keep us from rocks and shelving sands and save us from Bragg and Gurmo men's hands." So that one's kind of pointed at Mounts Bay a bit, but in other regions or other areas of Cornwall could also, you can say the same things about them. But this did lead some people to believe tinners were the main and perhaps only wreckers, and that fishermen didn't do it, or at least they weren't involved in violent plunder. But evidence does point to fishermen's complicity in wrecking as well as the miners. I mean, I'm not sure if fishermen were involved in the attack and plunder vessels. They may very well have been, especially since they made up the population of salvors. They were involved in both legal and illegal salvaging, and by that I mean that they were involved with salvage activities, but they would hand over some of the goods over to the customs collector, and then they would keep some for themselves. So they would do that at the same time. But they were also involved in the harvest activities, of course. But fishermen also had advantage of being first on the scene of a wreck because of their boats, and wrecked goods were also frequently found floating or even entangled in nets. If fishermen kept goods for their own use, that was considered by law a form of wrecking. The clergy. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the clergy being wreckers. And yes, popular accounts delight in retelling stories of their participation, especially what I call the ubiquitous parson story, whereby a local clergyman requested that his parishioners remain seated until he could take off his cassock so they could all start fair. And then the other one told a lot is about Reverend Troutbeck of Scilly, who's credited with the prayer, we pray thee, O Lord, not that wrecks should happen, but that if any wreck should happen, thou wilt give them, that will guide them into the Scilly Isles for the benefit of the poor inhabitants. Well, both of these stories have been identified in many Cornish districts. I have also found them in Wales, in Scotland, and in Ireland, and on. So they are most likely what we would call migratory legends. That just means that they are stories of an unknown provenance, but they are given a local meaning, and so that they have meaning to the people who tell the stories. But there are a handful of factual accounts too, showing clergy involved in wrecking, including Reverend James Cumming of Lansallos in 1708, Reverend Thomas Whitford of Curie in 1739, among others. But again, although the participation of some clergy is well substantiated, many others stood aloof and preached very vehemently to their parishioners on the evilnesses of wrecking in all of its forms, even harvest. And that you'll find Reverend George C. Smith of Penzance, as well as Reverend Richard Lyne of Little Petherick, all involved with those sermons, which they have also published. Well, there are, of course, lots of other people involved in wrecking. And one of the sources that I came across that was really interesting to read and very valuable is the writings of John Bray. John Bray was a former salvage agent. He was a ship owner and a constable of Bude. And he wrote an account of shipwrecks on the north coast around Bude from 1759 to 1830. And he identifies individuals and occupations in his account. So he describes something like 36 shipwrecks and named farmers, laborers, shoemakers, blacksmiths, smugglers, coopers, and even an excise man as known wreckers. He also mentions country people in general and describes scores of men, women, and children who poured down to the beach to harvest wrecked goods such as bell metal, beeswax, and Morocco leather, along with food stores. So from Bray's account and from accounts of the press, descriptions of the clergy, manorial court records, we can see that these country people of all occupations and men, women, and children were all involved with wrecking. But there are other wreckers as well. The last population that I was really working with in my studies were the gentry and the local lords of the manor. And they are not usually included in most popular works on wrecking. But the involvement of this population was central to many of the wrecking activities. The Arundels, the Bassets, the St. Albans, and some of the other lesser gentry all practiced some forms of wrecking as they controlled the wreck rights along the entire Cornish coast, along with the Duchy of Cornwall. And what this basically means is they had been given a royal grant that would allow them to have the rights to any unclaimed goods if they had not been claimed within this legal requisite of a year and a day. And some of them also had been practicing it for so long that they had these wreck rights by prescription, and that was practicing it even before, from time immemorial, which was from the 1100s back. But although the right of wreck was legal, the ways in which it was practiced often was not. Manorial lords frequently claimed goods for their own use. Often they did not report them to customs, so they didn't pay duties on them. Some of them didn't wait that requisite year and a day for the potential owner to claim them, but rather they would they would actually take half of the goods and give half to their tenants, because usually most of the goods here were harvested by their tenants. So they just paid for salvage payment in kind. And that was kind of the custom of the country. The customs had frequent altercations with manorial lords over wreck. And one of the cases I came across, which I thought was a bit amusing, was in 1763. The Penzance collector complained that a manorial lord had divided part of the brandy with the country people and thinks that the king's officers have nothing to do with it. That was an Arundel, by the way. The gentry also had disputes with other gentry about wreck rights. And there are quite a few legal cases that have been filed, especially between the Arundels of Llanern, the Bassets of Tahiti, and the Onslows of Llanelli. But just as in the case of the clergy, though, some manorial lords practiced wrecking, but not all. Some were insistent on holding to the letter of the law, and they took on the responsibilities. They paid salvage costs. They required positive identification to prove ownership of wrecked goods, and they released goods to their rightful owners. So it was mixed there. So we do know that wrecking involved all levels of society, men and women, adults and children, but that actually still doesn't mean that wrecking had cultural and communal consensus, because none of the populations wholly condoned wrecking. And as well, they also had different views and degrees of acceptance and in the way that they justified it. What I found was wreckers' motivations for what they did was as complex as the populations were involved. I mean, most believed that shipwrecks that came ashore were sent by God, that it was providence. And we have to remember that society then was not as secular as it is now. And so many people believed that God was omniscient and omnipresent, who's there. It's God's will. But also, of course, most of you have probably heard as well, thought about coastal communities in the 18th and 19th centuries being fairly poor, and more so during economic downturns. The 1790s and the 1840s were particularly tough. They did see an upsurge in wrecking, or at least in reported attempts. 3 months before the infamous Corn Riots in 1794, the Fly was plundered in Mounts Bay. The following year, the customs collector reported that the brig John had been plundered at Poldhu Cove, and 2 wreckers were killed by the local militia at that point. So the situation's fairly grim. It's exacerbated by grain prices, by the falling price of tin. So when a rich prize washes on the shores, it's no wonder that tinners felt compelled to act. The John especially was the cargo was amazing. It had a cargo of linen, wool and drapery, a large quantity of cutlery, silver, plated ware, iron and bars, port, puncheons of rum, ham, and cheese. So for people who are suffering from poverty, this really could be seen as providence. But another period of violent wrecking occurred in the Hungry 40s, and that was the height of the potato famine. And again, I'm sure most of you are aware of the effect that the potato famine had on Cornwall. And it was a period of intense immigration as well, during the Cornish diaspora. This is when my own family left Ulugan. But 2 famous forms of a rhyme might be familiar to you. The Eliza of Liverpool came on shore to feed the hungry and clothe the poor. And then the opposite, or a different location, the Good Samaritan came ashore to feed the hungry and clothe the poor. With barrels of beef and bales of linen, no poor soul shall want for a shilling. Well, both of these shipwrecks came ashore in 1846. The Eliza wrecked near Bude, and the Good Samaritan went ashore near Bedruth and Steps. But much wrecking activities undeniably occurred at times of dearth, and wrecked goods offered people a reprieve from hunger and want. But whole shipwrecks were actually very rare, and usually most wrecking activity involved beach harvest, and even that was rare. But I also found that not all wrecking activity could be attributed to providence or to poverty. There's plenty of evidence of wreckers' agency too. They made decisions whether to take away what they found or to work with customs, with Coast Guard, or local shipping agents to salvage the ship and cargo. So I came across what I eventually called moral entitlement to wreck. And this concept is also found in areas outside of Cornwall. I've also found it in the Thames estuary. But people understood the concept of salvage really well. And they wanted to make sure they received their fair share for the work and for the risk of saving the goods. And if they didn't get paid, well, what can they do? Well, Richard Pearce of Penzance actually argued that paying salvage fees up front was critical. And in 1833, he stated that it was his personal exertions in paying salvage up front that put a stop to the disgraceful system of plunder at wrecks. And then William Kent, an agent for the wrecked galleot Good Hope, also claimed that the plunder of the Resolution in 1817 was directly attributed to the non-payment of salvage fees from the Good Hope, which had wrecked the year previously. And then local magistrates and MPs in Cornwall and Wales pushed for improvements in salvage law and called for more timely salvage payments to prevent wrecking. So it's more the government's transgression of moral entitlement appears to have been one of the more important reasons behind wrecking on the part of those who wished to be legitimate salvers. That's a way that they could have their voice heard. But the custom of wrecking was clearly important for coastal populace of Cornwall, whether they were gentry or whether they were laborers. And clearly beach harvest was the most widely accepted. And it's this definition that is true when people say it's in our heritage, it's in our blood. But of course, stories of wrecks also contain large amounts of drink that is also carried through popular culture, and it shows in Cornish humor, as in this postcard I think I picked up actually back in 1982. But the question is wrecking unique to the Cornish? And I actually would say no, it isn't. What is unique is that wrecking is seen to be particularly Cornish, though, when it isn't. And that's the result of non-Cornish and Cornish writers through popular cultural media, by published folklore collections, Methodist writings, novels, operas, boys' adventure stories, artwork, tourism, it goes on. And so the myths, this combination of legend and reality, continue to capture people's imaginations, and they've captured my own as well, because I love working actually with the folklore. And so that is just a quick run through. I'd like to thank you, and I guess we could open it now for our question time. As soon as I stop sharing, and there
Okay.
I am.
And there you are back on screen.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah.
It is an extremely complicated picture.
Very.
It's not just a matter of saying, oh, it's a myth. There's actually all kinds of ambiguities and contradictions and changes in the wording, changes in the nature of the law, how it was enforced, and so on.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Let's now invite. I hope people aren't too stunned by all that. Let's now start to invite questions, and while we do, I'll throw in a couple of my own.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, as I understand it from some of our email correspondence, you were actually involved as one of the advisors on the Poldark stories.
No, it was a case of my book was used.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I follow on Twitter one of the historical consultants. We follow each other, and she had told me about it because she's worked on that in Jamaica Inn and a couple others. So no, I've done a few BBC presentations, documentaries on wrecking, but yeah, my book has been used more than I have in that case. Yes.
Okay. Again, whilst we're waiting for the questions to come in, I'm going to have to dredge into my own memory here of reading the book, it must be 7 years ago. One of the things that struck me was that you contrast not just the way the wrecking was seen by people from outside of Cornwall compared with the much more complex reality and the kind of the myth making, the othering
Mm-hmm.
of faraway people with strange and guttural language and so on. But also that a lot of the law on wrecking that conferred wrecking rights goes back to the Norman era,
Mm-hmm.
when the lords of the manor were the law, and national law was relatively insignificant. So it didn't have the reach, it didn't have the authority.
Exactly, yes.
And so it is the local lords of the manor who were very much interwoven with the magistracy,
Mm-hmm.
whose rights were being removed by the encroachment of a more sort of national lawmaking.
Yes, yes, you remember
Is that,
very well.
this is the extent to which who makes the law and
Yes,
who enforces
yes.
the law can be a much more complex set of relationships about policing by consent and so on.
Oh, definitely. And it gets very, um, yeah, as you say, it's very complex, and even digging through all those records are very tough. It took me quite a few months to actually do the research just on medieval rec law, because I felt I needed to kind of get to grips what it was before, because I focused on the 18th and 19th century, but I needed to know more about earlier. And that was an interesting research as well, particularly because a lot of the records about rec rights in some of the areas, when I was looking particularly at Kent, Battle Abbey, for instance, had rec rights.
Mm-hmm.
But then you start finding out and kind of reading documents and some of the legal historians, you find out that the abbots of Battle Abbey actually made up their documents. So, there's, and that's where it gets really fun, with all the research, because you really do have to look at those documents. You have to read between the lines sometimes. You have to look at who's writing the documents, what they're really trying to get at. And particularly because there's so much conflict about wrecking and rec rights. And there was, so you do have lords of the manor who were practicing by local custom. And then around, I can't remember the exact dates anymore. It was in the medieval period that when the monarch was starting to try to gain control over rec rights, that he actually sent out somebody to look at all of the different areas that had rec rights and try to claim them back for himself. And that didn't go over very well, because a lot of the lords of the manor were able to show that they had practiced it from time immemorial. And so that's what we call the legal idea of prescription is based upon that. So they either got through prescription from practicing it from time immemorial, or some of the monarchs that actually gave rec rights to various magnates so they could get loyalty, for instance. So in Cornwall, it does get very interesting, because you do have the individual lords of the manor, but you also have the duchy there. And the duchy went through some, several hundred years, was fairly weak. And so early in the medieval era, they were good at practicing rec rights, practicing, all the various rights that they had. But then the duchy ends up getting weaker. And so it just kind of allows the local lords of the manor to take over, more power and control. And the duchy actually doesn't get back that control again until the 19th century. So there's, that's just a whole other story.
Yeah, that's another whole dimension to it as well. And the duchy was still the youngest, or the heir incumbent.
Yes, yes.
That national to local isn't even as simple as that. Even at local level, there's an
No.
idea which is also nice.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to start working our way through some of these questions then. David asks, after that conclusion, is there anything at all that is unique to Cornwall in regard to wrecking, the extent to which it's carried out, or the way it was kind of blurred in with different layers of society? Was that different from other areas, or is there anything at all that's different?
Well, what I think, I'm still working with some of the other areas, because I was thinking of perhaps, the idea of tinners and miners attacking wrecks, that could possibly be possibly unique to Cornwall. But I have come across accounts of other populations, like in Kent, attacking ships. But I think maybe it lasted in Cornwall a little bit longer. and Wales as well. I should say Wales actually is about equal to Cornwall in many ways with wrecking. But I think different areas of the British Isles, depending on when they started to be brought into that centralized government, there are some areas that did it earlier and then kind of stopped. It's like with the Kent area, particularly the Goodwin Sands. But what's kind of interesting between the two areas is with Cornwall, I find more of the stories and more of the legends that are actually involve people that are still on shore. So on the littoral, so the miners, whatever, attacking ships, where when it comes to the Kent and the Goodwin Sands, a lot of those stories are actually the boatmen that are involved. So there's going to be a difference based upon geography, and based upon the coastal areas and some of the practices. So the areas that had a lot of boatmen, Suffolk, so that kind of East Anglia, Kent, parts of Sussex, the coast is very different there. It's not as many cliffs or anything. There were a lot of boatmen that would take supplies in and out of ships because they didn't even really have very good harbors necessarily. I think they're different than in Cornwall itself. So I think that the way it's practiced is different. The laws are national. But what is unique about Cornwall is that the stories are told. If you say wreckers, everybody thinks Cornwall. And I'm really interested in that. He's like, why don't people say Wales? Because they're Celtic, they're Methodist there, there's all these similarities, but it's Cornwall.
Yeah, how come Northumberland got away with it for so long?
Yeah, I know. I've been investigating a false light story there. But that actually, yeah, again, it has to do with the lighthouse there and lights confusing people.
Okay,
So.
I'll try and take us on through the questions here. So Peter asks, what about modern stuff that washes up? I mean, in terms of what is the law now? When is beachcombing verging on wrecking, and what's illegal? What is legal and what's illegal? What's owned by who?
Yes. The way the law reads is that anything that comes ashore from a shipwreck, especially, if you're thinking like Branscombe a couple of years ago when you had, all the BMWs coming ashore, and all of that comes ashore like that is actually the way the law reads now is that a person should fill out a form by that's actually on the website for the receiver of wreck. So there's an official government position of receiver of wreck, and they will get the forms. Yeah, and that way, I mean, if it's something big, a person finding it would get salvaged from it, but a lot of times it's just released to the person who found it, and then it's all legal. It's all above board. If that's not done, then conceivably the owners of the goods, or the ship or the government could actually come after you. But in practice, it's not done that very often. In fact, even with the wreck, all the BMW stuff at Branscombe that came ashore a couple of years ago, in that case, I think BMW just gave this stuff up. They said, yeah, you can go ahead and have this motorcycle, but it's no longer covered by warranty, anything, because it's had, salt water damage and that sort of thing. Because it really does come down to whether or not is it worth it to pay salvage on it? Is it worth it to press charges or anything? So
if they have the right to claim it back, if they can find out that we're the ones that actually picked the stuff up, it's the same old message. If you strike lucky, don't put it on Facebook. That's a lesson for our time. Okay.
Yeah, or in the Daily Mail, some pictures.
And so Henry makes a similar point. When the Cita went ashore on the Scillies, lots of lofts and garages filled up, and otherwise it would have gone to waste. So it is harvesting to that extent.
Yes.
Megan, do we know how large groups would spread, if there were such communities of such size or different groups within the same community, how would they split wrecked goods? You mentioned a split between the landlord, the local lord, who does have the right and then sometimes chooses, sometimes does not, to enforce a 50-50 split. But are there stories of fighting between rival groups of people trying to harvest or wreck?
There are a few stories. I think it was between Curie and now I can't remember the name of the other parish. There are a few stories, not that many, but there are a few stories of some conflict. What I found was actually interesting, though, because of course those accounts those all-scale those attacks are so rare, so we don't even have that many stories of them. What we do have is people finding wreck and bringing it ashore if something happened offshore and things kind of came floating in. And what I actually found really interesting as far as custom was Nick Dark. I was able to meet with him, and we had this wonderful evening just talking wrecking before he died. And he was saying that even in his neighborhood, that the wreckers, because he called himself a wrecker, that they would bring wreck ashore and they would leave it in particular areas, and other people knew that it was theirs. So they kind of left it for people, and it was just one of their rules that they had, which I found was really interesting. But in cases of plunder, there's all these things going on, and yeah, there were usually large groups of people. A lot of them were coming down for salvaging, to be involved with that salvage activity. Others may have wanted to plunder, possibly if they could get in on it, just like now. In some ways, human behavior hasn't changed too much.
But the story of these, vicious cormorants, as one of the authors put it, cormorants would fight over well, actually, I don't know much about cormorants, but
they do.
but seagulls, for example, would certainly fight each other over goods. But if there's no stories of that, you'd have thought the press would latch onto that and really make something of it if it was happening.
Yeah. I mean, they have made up. There are a couple stories that they did, but when you start looking through the newspapers in context and looking at those stories in context, it goes years before there's another one. But then they try to make it sound like it's a moral panic. Basically, this is happening all the time. This is what the Cornish are doing. They're all attacking all these ships. And it's like, when was the last time? Oh yeah, 20 years ago. So,
well, that makes the Cornish folk devils then in terms of that.
Yes.
So Henry, good old Henry. Henry was an ex-Coast Guard and
yay,
knows these things. He can confirm that there is a receiver of wrecks that also oversees anything that comes ashore and adjudicates the values with the insurers. So that is still very much alive and present.
It is.
And interesting that none of the rest of us even knew about it. Thanks, Henry. That's really appreciated. Now, Maria asks if there are there particular people known. Most, even folk devils, tend to get their heroes, the sort of the Robin Hoods or the Billy the Kids and so on. People who are known for it.
Yeah. This is what's really interesting. No. If you look at the folklore of Cornwall and you look at the wrecker tales, the wrecker is always an evil person. He is always someone from elsewhere, whether it's a pirate wrecker, whether it's, his name just went out of my head. North Coast. Darn memory. Very well-known smuggler. Anyway, yeah.
That doesn't narrow it down a lot.
I've been losing my words lately. But yeah, I mean, if you do look at the stories that were told of wreckers, that they almost always, to a person, actually to a man, were from elsewhere. And it's kind of interesting. It's like there's a different morality between wrecking and what God brings ashore versus a deliberate wrecker. And the folkloric wreckers are all deliberate wreckers. So they're deliberate. They're not following God's will. they're going out, they're using false lights, or whatever to lure ships ashore. So they're not seen as heroic at all, which I find absolutely fascinating in looking at those, because I was looking at the pirate record quite in detail, actually, because that is another one that has a lot of bits of it from different times and different eras have been put together into the stories that are told, like in Hunt's book. And they're migratory legends that have actually had place put on top of them. So all of a sudden in Pirate Record, you get specific places there. Sennen is, particularly there. Particular sites on the coast are named in those legends, but you might find a similar legend would actually be told up in Wales, but it has Welsh, characters of Welsh names attached, Welsh place names. So yeah, the folklore is really fascinating.
So these are almost what we would now call memes.
Yes,
These
yeah.
are ideas floating around in the subconscious, perhaps.
Almost, yeah. Or tropes. Yeah.
And they get projected onto any handy available people.
Yes.
When you sent us through the pictures, for some of our own publicity, I'd added to that 2 other images that you hadn't produced. One is that thing of "Here be monsters."
Yes, yes.
Map where beyond a certain area there are humans with head and no neck, or legs going. That people fantasize, they project onto the remote all kinds of grotesque constructions of their own.
Yes.
And the other image that I put up and I suggested we use was Asterix the Gaul.
Yeah.
The other image is the kind of noble savage, this heroic, plucky little character.
Yes, yes.
So do you never get any of the noble savage? Do you never get any of the story of wreckers being in any way
not
within the local community?
Yeah.
Saviors of the
Not really. No. Yeah, definitely not that the noble savage aspect of that doesn't come through, whether in Cornwall or outside of Cornwall. I mean, you get stories of acceptance of wrecking, but again, that's more harvest. That's not some of the other more violent means. And even I mean, Bray's account was kind of like that. He absolutely accepted harvest, and the only time that he had any any enmity towards wreckers is if they were violent. So, but no, I haven't. Yeah, no Robin Hoods, no noble savages as that. No. And I'm just trying to even think of the caricatures of the Cornish from outside. It's usually not noble either. They're usually bumbling, or they're not civilized and they're backwards. Even back in the 18th and centuries on. So it is interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we don't have many questions coming up, but we've got quite a few comments from people talking about stuff that has come on shore.
Oh, excellent.
This might be a whole new research area for you. A badly decomposed whale drifted into our cove. I'm not quite sure where Peter is. I think he's north coast. 2 youngsters towed it out, attached it to a buoy to relieve the inhabitants of the smell. They weren't eaten off with the blubber. And they got £50 from the receiver of wrecks for their trouble. They
would, yeah. Whales are actually a little bit of a different case. Whales don't normally come under wreck law because they were considered royal fish. All whales belong to the crown. Yeah. But yes, whales do smell when they come ashore if they're dead. Yes.
So hold on. Whales belong to the crown if they come on shore. Whereas if we go out there and hunt for them, there's a whole whaling industry.
Yes.
Half folk songs, half of the sea shanties are about whales.
Yes, some great ones. Yes. Yeah. No, whales were considered royal fish. Because back then they thought they were fish.
Okay. Now, we've got an enormous what's the word? Knowledgeable. That's the word.
Okay, yes.
Knowledgeable people. If a ship gets into trouble and needs a tow, the common agreement with is a Lloyd's Open. An agreed Lloyd's insurance will come to a conclusion on costs afterwards. So first of all, you have the agreement in place in outline, and then later they work out the costs. So that's a little bit similar in some ways, isn't it, to the divvying up of the spoils? Only now it's no longer the lord of the manor; it's the Lloyd's. From
And in that case too, the law is slightly different because that would be under admiralty law rather than under land law. So particularly in the 19th century, there is that differentiation really comes into play, because for a long time, like lords of the manor could claim anything that was they could see as far out to sea as a Hamborough barrel, so out to sea. But in the 19th century, as you've got the duchy is starting to get control, and the crown starting to get control, the government, they actually then, the courts decide that if a wreck comes ashore, if it's on dry land, then it can be claimed by wreck rights. If it is floating, that's admiralty rights. So that's a whole other layer of salvage issues that has to do with where the wreck is actually found, if it's floating or if it's not floating.
So those people up in around Dover, where you said it tended to be more the fishermen or the boat using folk, should we say, who were associated with wrecking. It's admiralty stuff that they were nicking.
And so that's where a lot of those cases are going to be in the admiralty records. But that area is even more complex because of the sink ports come into play. So it's at least Cornwall doesn't have to deal with the sink ports, and that layer of bureaucracy.
I'm guessing you'd rather we don't ask you any more about that.
No, it's okay. I mean, I have done a talk on wrecking in Kent and also in Sussex. So I have looked in those areas a little bit more. Although some of the North Sea areas are now going to be hoisted off to a PhD student of mine who's just coming along. So.
Okay. We also have, Megan is asking, Megan has heard that there was a famous wreck at Dollar Cove. Do you know any wrecking stories? I don't even know where Dollar Cove is.
I do. I'm trying to remember back in that, I think was supposed to be a Spanish wreck from 14 or 1500 or somewhere around there. And there's stories that every once in a while, is it like silver doubloons or something's come ashore in that area, dollars that come ashore. So people are still looking for that wreck. I'm hoping I remember this right. It's been a while since I read about it. But
this is such a fragmented picture of this. I'm
it is.
unfair to ask you to know so much about it.
No, I left most of the stuff out. So
Vernon is, again, a comment rather than a question, but mentions the story of Sir Cloudesley Shovel and his emerald ring as an extreme libel on the Cornish. Well, apart from the fact that the Solonians don't regard themselves as Cornish.
Exactly. Yes.
Oh no, that's not us.
No. Yeah.
So it's an extreme libel on the Silonians that gets blamed on the Cornish, you might say.
Yes.
But do you have any knowledge of that story? Do you have any?
That is one of those legends, one of those lovely stories that there's not really that much of truth in it. Because I think the other part of the story is that where Sir Cloudesley Shovel washed ashore, that no grass grows there in that area. There's the kind of stories about people stealing things off of him and all. So there's various versions of the story that don't quite hold up to scrutiny either, but they're good stories. And I can understand, the poor Solonians, I mean, because the Duchy of Cornwall, but particularly outside of Cornwall and the Isles Scilly, people do tend to see them all in together. And some of the same people were going back and forth, like between Penzance and St. Agnes as well. And then there's also the stories. Scilly has some really good stories, particularly the lighthouse there at St. Agnes, and has supposedly the lighthouse keeper deliberately wrecked ships there. And that was one of the first stories that I really started getting into. And I got so excited researching it because a lot of those records are actually held in London at the Guildhall. And I had all the minute books there and just going through all the minute books about the building of the lighthouse, you know, all the problems that they had with the types of coal and how so some of the coal was so bad that it caused a lot of smoke, you know, and they had problems with the glass and all this stuff. Then eventually I started getting to the wreck that happened right there on the island, and then that's kind of seeds of the legend there. But when you're reading it, you kind of understand how the wreck actually happened. It wasn't a case of him dousing the lights at all. Yeah, there were the problems with the lights, yes, but it wasn't something that he deliberately did. And it says nothing like that in any of the records of Trinity House at all. In fact, what happened is some of the story actually, it's because whoever started that story didn't finish, or they might not have even had access to all the records to follow the story all the way through of that lighthouse keeper, you know, and the investigation. They found out that he was actually, you know, innocent of it was actually taking stuff that came ashore. So, I mean, he was found innocent of all of that because he had collected it to save it for the year and the day to hand over to customs. So, I mean, there's again lots of layers to it. But when I was working on that story, it's like I was coming close to actually figure out what's going on, and it's like I can't believe the Guildhall actually kicked me out for the night, and I had to come back another day to actually look at it.
I'm beginning to spot a kind of pattern here as well, that actually somebody had bought some poor quality dodgy coal that creates a lot of smoke, and to defend themselves against having probably pilfered the original cost and so on, they blame the I made that up, I know.
Yeah, because there's this, yeah, they weren't the ones who brought the coal, and they were actually testing coal from different areas, for Welsh coal, you know, from the Northeast, and yeah, and I mean, it was the 17th century, you know, it was, yeah.
Again, we have no more questions coming in, so I'm going to throw in some more of my own. Can we double back a little bit?
Sure.
I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea that in the days before we had a national navy, before we had the income to purchase a navy or to employ them, the entire British army, the British state was dependent on effectively privateers. So ordinary shipping could then be enlisted on the war effort, and when the war stopped, they turned into pirates, because where else was there for them to go?
Yeah, that was actually after we had a Royal Navy as well. Because before the Royal Navy, I mean, the monarch would have a few ships, and then if they went to war, then they would have agreements with owners of vessels, and then they would change the vessels over a little bit to make them into more war vessels. Yeah, gradually you do get, you know, full Royal Navy. But privateers were usually hired on top of what the Royal Navy was doing, because then the privateers, yes, they would go out and then attack enemy shipping, or, you know, enemy cargo ships or whatever. And there were a few that did, you know, maybe push the law a little bit too much, even when they were privateers, and kind of went after, you know, shipping that was not necessarily from anybody at war. And yes, some of them went full out pirate afterwards. Yeah,
they were the mercenaries, effectively, and if you couldn't afford to pay them, then you could expect the consequences.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking there's something rather similar in that kind of, you know, one day you're on the side of the law, next time you're the enemy. There's something rather similar in the relationship with the local lords of the land, lords of the manor, who have the wrecking rights. So sometimes they're seen as the gentry, and sometimes they're seen as corrupt.
Yeah, and then well, one of the differences with the privateers as well is that ships were not normally owned by one person. They were owned in shares. So it might be, you know, one particular ship might be owned by all quite a few of the leading ship owners in the village, or shipbuilders. Sometimes the captains or the masters might have a share in them. So there was actually very complex, again, nothing's ever simple, is it? But yeah, very complex ownership to some of these ships.
So that in effect, they're joint stock enterprises.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. It's a way to spread risk.
But you didn't get the company formation that you got for the railroads until you got much bigger scale of things.
Yes, yes.
Okay. And it tended to be local, tended to be people in the same town, or people who knew each other and who were...
Yeah, not always. Sometimes it was other families in other places, but yes, a lot of times it did tend to be local. So yeah, a lot of the smaller, the coastal villages that had small shipbuilding, shipbuilders there, that they would be involved. Helen Doe is actually somebody that's written a lot about shipbuilding in Cornwall, and can discuss all the ownership of these ships and specific ones. Particularly, she was in Polruan, I think, and Loo, and some of those areas that she was involved with research.
But would they tend to be owned by local people? Would they be local ships in that sense?
Yeah.
Oh, so the wrecking is actually wrecking of other Cornish people that are taking the...
No, well, normally, okay, because that's one of those interesting debates to find out exactly who's being wrecked.
Mm-hmm.
But in some...
Follow the money, as they say.
Yeah, and a lot of times, a lot of the Cornish shipping is relatively small ships. A lot of times they're carrying like China clay, or a little bit of coal out of Wales. They're not the really rich ships. And those are the ships of legend, are those like the East India Company. There's like 4 different East India Company vessels that wrecked on the shores of Cornwall over like a 200 period that were really rich. Like one had diamonds, on board and things. So yeah, those are ships that if they were coming in from India, and wrecked on the shores, those are the vessels of legend. Or vessels that are owned by the King of Spain or something. But those are very, very rare. But those are the good stories. I mean, most of the time, vessels, if they were in trouble, they would come ashore, but they would be fixed and they would be refloated. So they actually were very lucrative in a way for places like Falmouth or Penzance. The shipbuilders also repaired ships. So yeah, going through a lot of the cases, when you're looking at them in context, what you do find is most of them are refloated.
So that story you mentioned of somebody boring a hole in the ship's hull as an evidence story, that wasn't just a myth, but you were saying that really did happen. And
yes, it really did happen. Yes.
But that's to get the insurance. That's not wrecking in the sense of...
No. That's wrecking a ship to get the insurance. Yes, I haven't come across any right in Cornwall for that, but definitely there's been a few that happened to in the Bay of Biscay. So yes, there's plenty of insurance fraud. The Cornish did. I guess I haven't come across any cases of this one I'm thinking about, but I'm sure there must have been in other areas. But cutting a ship's cables, so that the cables that the anchor is attached to, when a ship is still on just kind of has been maybe outside of a port or something, and it put down their anchors, if it's a bad weather or something, maybe, of perhaps some people rowing out there, cutting the cables and then rowing back, and then the ship is out of control, it no longer has the anchors, and then it comes on shore. I've come across 4 accounts of that so far in my research. And yeah, so that's a deliberate wrecking. It's just not as romantic as false lights.
And would that be what are called the literal people, the people who lived in that area? Or would that be the agents of the shipping owners?
Those are the people of the literal. one of the cases that it actually appears in the manorial court records, because they were brought up to the manorial court. It was the Arundels there, and this happened on Penwith actually. And it's kind of interesting because it doesn't say what they did with the individuals that did it, but they listed names and they listed what they did and how much, like I think it was like kegs of butter and things that they actually brought ashore. And there's this big list of what they got out of it.
Which takes us on, as luck would have it, nicely to the next question I was going to go to.
Yeah.
Caroline asks, regarding splitting whatever's come ashore, would that have been by some kind of shares, or would it be, who would decide who got what? Was it just a free-for-all, or was there more, politesse or organisation? If you were to own the boat, this is a more specific bit, I suppose.
Okay.
If you were to own the boat that went to get the goods from a wreck, would you expect to end up with more of the proceeds?
Possibly, depending on what you did with it. If you brought it ashore, nobody else saw it, and you got it in your cellar. If it's wreck that's come ashore, normally people are not by themselves. There's no way that a person could get a mast, ashore and above the tide line by themselves. So in that case, they may split it amongst themselves, but 50% would go to the Lord of the Manor, and then they would split up, 50% themselves. So it depends a lot of what actually was coming ashore. If it was a barrel full of wine, sometimes that did not make it. Sometimes it did. Although, I came across, it was actually in some of the court records from Tahiti that was really interesting. Some of the tenants there, one brought back a lot of bacon. I think it was bacon that had come ashore. And it was the son brought it to the mother, and the mother said, "No, I don't want this. It goes to the Lord of the Manor." And she actually made her son take it to the steward to go to the Lord of the Manor. So in her case, that's where she followed that kind of law. In fact, the Lord of the Manor's prescription, a law that was based and proven by tenant testimony. And so they do talk a little bit about splitting up goods amongst themselves, how they were to do it, and what goes to the Lord of the Manor, to the steward, and then on to the Lord of the Manor. So it was
and that particular incident is recorded. That wasn't just a story. That was genuinely a fact.
Genuinely recorded. Yep. It's in the in the records.
So that does say a lot about the moral entitlement.
It does.
Doesn't it?
Yes.
It personalizes it, but it actually tells a much, much bigger story.
It does. It really does. So no, a lot of times it wasn't a free-for-all. It depended upon who was doing it, what they were trying to get out of it. As I said, some of them would actually take part of it to the customs or to Lord of the Manor and keep part of it themselves as well. It depends upon, I think, the individual and how much they were driven by what they thought was right. So that very much that moral.
So much for the story of cormorants, hey? So David asks, in the time of wrecking, whatever, all the different possible meanings and misunderstandings of that term, did people generally, people up country, I suppose, or people locally too, believe in these folklore stories of deliberate wrecking? And how, do you have any thoughts on how that impacted on how people saw the Cornish? Or was it just grist to the mill of seeing these outlandish, guttural people?
Yeah, it was probably a bit of grist to the mill, because I keep looking to find out what, if sailors, or, ship's masters or whatever, if they're concerned about wrecking in the Cornish coast as they're going by or whatever. And most of the time I don't. I mean, they're more afraid of navigational issues. They do sometimes, I think they're a bit afraid of maybe having, if they do wreck, of being plundered. That is a fear, but I haven't come across that much about the deliberate wrecking at all. I'm even thinking of the other stories of the false lights. I mean, there was one up in Wales that had been I think even John Rule at the time thought that it was one of the cases of false lights that was true. And that one, the newspapers actually printed that this ship had been wrecked because of false lights. And then the master and his wife were robbed and almost murdered, for the goods by the wreckers there. They're as bad in the stories. But but that wasn't true. And the master's like, no, there was no false lights. That wasn't it at all. So I haven't really come across. There are concerns about navigation and about confusion over which lighthouse. Back before they were automated, and when people could tell where they were because of the light pattern. How often they would actually flash, because we've got that now, so you can tell which lighthouse. And times before then there was confusion sometimes, and ships ended up in the Bristol Channel and meant to go to the English Channel and that sort of thing. But
I'm dredging up somewhat from our memory here, so I'm a little hazy on the details, but I recall recently reading that there was, I believe, one individual who was very keen on developing lighthouses around the coast. Might have been an official, but each lighthouse would require something like an act of parliament to get the money together for it. And it tended to be the local gentry who were represented in parliament, who were opposed and put up as much opposition as they could, precisely because this was denying them their wrecking opportunities.
Yes,
that's a different part of the story. Can you flesh that out at all?
Yes, this is a story that comes out when people are looking at the history of the Lizard, because the Lizard was one of the first lighthouses, and that was actually built by Killigrew. And there are some that said that the local people were against the lighthouse because that would stop ships wrecking on the Lizard, and would affect it. Similar stories are also told up in Scotland as well. But one of the problem with the Lizard as well is that a lot of the ship owners around the country did not want the lighthouse there, because they would have to pay light dues whenever a lighthouse is there. That's why the Killigrews were interested in putting a lighthouse there, is because they wanted to charge light dues for the ships they went away. Yeah.
So you had to pay to pass.
You had to pay, You had to pay for light dues. You had to pay entry to go into different ports. Oh yeah, there's this whole other world of what people had to pay. Yeah.
This is gloriously complex, isn't it? Okay, I'll tell you what, let's take us now to a completely different area. Okay. We have a question from, not a question exactly, but a comment from Mahira, who is in Karachi in Pakistan, one of our occasional members. We're quite international here,
Excellent.
Is there an international perspective? There must be. There are seas around every coastline. There must be some kind of norms or laws on some degree of wrecking, or at least of who has the rights in every country. Is there anything like an international perspective on this that we can add? Or is it, again, you're going to tell me it's complicated.
Always that's my favorite answer. It's complicated. There were, as far as the European countries, around the Mediterranean, France, come out into parts of the Atlantic, there was kind of a recognition of a wreck law that was called the Rolls of Oleron. There are medieval type wreck laws that people kind of understood, particularly because, when you've got ships that are going from port to port and trading from the Mediterranean to trading to, what is now the UK, or up to France or to the Netherlands, there were accepted kind of laws and practices around that area. It's not necessarily global as such, because there may be different laws in the Indian Ocean, for instance, because there was tremendous trade in the Indian Ocean, and shipwrecks that happened during monsoon or whatever. One of the first things that got me interested in actually wrecking and wreck law, the first time I came across it, was actually a shipwreck that happened on the coast of Oregon in the Pacific Northwest. of North America, and that was a shipwreck from the Hudson's Bay Company, and they lost all their goods to the local native people that were there. And they're kind of, trying to bring it, like this idea of wreck law. And it's like, well, the people around there don't recognize European wreck law, at all. And that was more of a finders keepers kind of thing for them. So I mean, it's taken a while and more global trade and everything to carry out some of these laws. And of course, some of them then went out with the British Empire into other areas. They would carry. So North America, Australia, and on also have similar laws and receivers of wreck and that sort of thing. So similar structures.
Which again takes us nicely on to Mahira's second comment, which is that, of course, there were the British there. The British Empire would have spread its wish to have law and to negotiate law with local customs and local lords of the manor, or the equivalent.
Yeah, well, their tendency though was just to take the law of the elite and put it on top of whatever location there is, without necessarily recognizing.
But would they then try and enforce it in complex and ambiguous, contested ways? I'm answering my own question here, aren't I?
Yes. They tended not to recognize local rights as much as they had to early on, when we're looking at the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. Yeah.
And Caroline tells us that there are stories from Western Denmark too. Again, a very crinkly coastline.
Yes.
And a very pretty impoverished communities, as seen by the landmass, which I guess will be Germany in those days.
Yes. Yeah. And Baltic the Baltic. I went to a really interesting conference several years ago in Helsinki, because there is a historian of wrecking in Copenhagen, or I'm not in Copenhagen, but in Helsinki. And it was kind of interesting because one of the differences that they have there, of course, is they had serfdom there a lot longer, but they still had similar kind of customs of dividing wrecked goods, but the lords there had a lot more control for a lot longer in those areas. But one of the really interesting things that came out of the research is that they have stories now of false lights that are told and that are put in fiction and everything. Again, no stories of false lights, because in the area in the Baltic, they would make absolutely no sense, because they didn't actually sail at night. They didn't use lighthouses, because and if you go to the Baltic, you can understand why. There's all these very low-lying islands. It's really dangerous to go through those areas of the Baltic. So it's like, you just do not sail at night. Just does not make sense.
But you wouldn't want to waste a good story though.
Exactly. And that's exactly it, because they do have some great stories about it now.
The other thing I was thinking, when you were saying that in the medieval or the early medieval era, there was some kind of broad general understanding about rights but of course you did have things like the Holy Roman Empire, and particularly you had the church.
Yes.
Not only creating, but of course writing the laws, because they were the ones who could read and write, including in Battle Abbey, writing
making the contracts. Yeah. I'm trying to think. One thing that I actually didn't touch on, because again, it's fairly big, was actually criminal law. That now you get fined, but if you were caught wrecking, particularly plundering a wreck in the 18th century, that actually, if you're caught, it could be the death sentence. And Cornwall actually does have one person who was executed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he was 80 years old as well.
80?
Yeah, and he probably was not guilty of plundering the wreck, but he was kind of held up as an example. So I did write an article about his case, and that's in the National Maritime Museum. Falmouth has a online journal called Trose, and I wrote up that article, and it's in Trose, if anybody's interested in reading about poor William Pearce. Same name. I don't think he's related. He's further towards Devon than my family were from, but really interesting case about.
Now.
It's an interesting case about criminal law, And there again, there's these layers of, you know, whether or not that somebody who was caught wrecking, whether or not they would actually be turned over to the law. And a lot of times they weren't, because people knew about that law. They used kind of a form of discretion. It's like, okay, we'll just you know, try them for trespass, for instance. You were not going to take them to the assizes, because if they go to the assizes, then that's it.
So if we were looking for a local hero, an 80-year-old, that, come on, all you Cornish theatre goers and playwrights and
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly. Yeah, what? It's a tragic story. Oh, being locked up in Launceston Castle, and taken to Bodmin, and
we need the tragic hero at this.
Yeah, I think in a way he was, because he was caught with some rope, and that was it. You know, so yeah.
As if nobody else used rope in a fishing community.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Dear. Cathryn, that's been an absolutely fascinating talk. It just lifts the lid on such a more complex world.
There's still so much to do.
Yeah. Now, with any Café Sci talk, we ask you to give a 20-minute talk and then see what else comes up. But there might always be some other thing that you'd wished somebody had asked you. Is there anything else that's niggling away that you think, oh, I'd love to tell them this? Yeah, I'll take it for an answer.
Yeah, there's so much. I'll be looking at my notes. Oh yeah, that. Yeah. Because there are wonderful stories about it, and I said that there's work that I still really want to do, because I am very fascinated actually by the folklore and sense of place. And said I've started to work on that quite a bit, because sense of place has always been very important to me, even growing up. So I've done a paper on that a couple times. Actually, I think the last time I did it was in Lou. No, it wasn't Lou. It was in, oh, now I can't remember. Maybe it was Falmouth that I've done it, but I still need to get it published. So it keeps getting kind of refined in there. But one of the groups I'm involved with now is the Coastal History Group, and we're particularly looking at history of the littoral, particularly of populations, as you know, who had, I think the saying is one boot on the shore and one boot in the boat. You know, and that's how a lot of the communities were. Even the mining communities were that way. Even the tinners, you know, even though they working in the mines, they still went out and they fished. You know, because people did whatever jobs that they could do for survival on the shore, and they had really, again, a complex relationship with the sea there. And so
this subject, this group, may well be something we want to come back to another time then.
Yes.
We this first season of our virtual cafe talks, we're sort of throwing out ideas all over to see what people
and they're just starting as well, so
so good timing. Who knows what citizen science might come out of that. Exactly. Two things then. Heather was saying is she'd love to hear about your current work on life saving.
Yes.
That might tie in with Henry, who was a Coast Guard, and
it would, because the Coast Guard are there.
I think this coastal community's history and present day maybe has got some mileage in it. Yes. I got your book from the library, and so I don't have a copy of it to show people. I don't even have the title, but I was hoping
this might. I don't know if it actually. It's probably all backwards, isn't it?
Lift it up a bit. No, it's fine. We can't see a bit more. Cornish wrecking, 1700 to 1860, reality and popular myth. That's the book. Yeah, that's the book. So there we are, folks. It was in Falmouth Library. I'm sure you could order it there. Yes. And if you'd like another, 200 or so pages of going into this in even greater complexity. Yeah, because I had to leave out most of the popular culture aspect of it when I wrote the book. You know, I had to leave it out of my PhD. Then I left it for the book. Then I had to leave it out of the book, and now I still have it to work on. So yeah, there's quite a bit. But the life-saving stuff is fascinating. I ended up working with a group called the Shipwreck Mariners and Fishermen, which I'm messing it up, Shipwreck Fishermen and Mariners Royal Benevolent Society.
they call themselves the Shipwreck Mariners, and so they allowed me to digitize most of their minute books. So I've been going through the minute books and looking at cases, because they were founded as a national organization to help particularly fishermen, but also mariners who had lost their ships or boats by rough seas, rough weather. And some of the earlier cases were actually in Cornwall. So with the loss of some of the fishing fleets in Cornwall. So there is definitely that connection there that I'm slowly working on. But there's so much to go into, and of course the Coast Guard are very much involved with them too, because they acted as honorary agents.
So I think maybe we come back to you at some point, not necessarily you, but anyone in your group, about life-saving, RNLI,
yes.
Coast Guards, the sense of community, the sense of place and belonging, and we are the only part of the country, I believe, that still funds our air sea rescue helicopters.
Oh yeah.
A popular contribution. So maybe that could be something for we do ask that people, if they can and if they wish to, make a small contribution to the cost of these talks, and 25% goes to our coffers, because any organization is supposed to be income generating.
Right
75% goes to a chosen charity. So let's maybe try and work this in for some point in the future with the shipwreck.
Yes.
Cathryn, that was absolutely fascinating. It's a delight to actually get to meet you and talk to you.
It's good to be able to talk about it again, because I said I've been working on my brain has been in Liverpool in 1840, lately. Working on a paper up there, kind of an urban space, and that's not me. I am more of a rural person. So my heart's in Cornwall. So
welcome back.
It has been for a long time, even before I knew about my family.
So at this point, let me pause for a moment. We usually try and mention the website where we have the recordings of these talks and so on. So that it usually takes us a few days or so, sometimes as much as a week, to actually get the talk. But you will be able, if you're wanting to tell people about this talk, Cathryn, you yourself and your students, but also any members of our audience, there will be a recording of the whole thing available in hopefully just a few days' time. And David, can I pass over to you now to tell people about next week's talk?
Yeah, absolutely. So next week we've got Dr. Peter Morwell talking on astrobiology and trying to find which salt crystals on Mars might support life and which might not. So a completely different topic from today. I'm sure it will be interesting again too.
Sounds very interesting.
So it'll be great to see some people there too.
It certainly is a diverse range of subjects that we
It is, but I love it, because at some points it all comes together. I used to be a biology major. My science wasn't wasted because I taught environmental history then. It all fits.
There will be a connection, if only
there is. Yeah.
Only a good metaphor at some point. Okay.